She visited the shooting range every weekend for 5 years. Everyone called her the quiet woman in pink. Earmuffs until a training exercise went wrong and instructors started mocking her. A SEAL commander stood up silencing the room. That woman outshot every special forces operator I've ever trained. One demonstration later, the entire range fell silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen was 47 years old, stood 5'3", and always wore a pastel cardigan over her blouse when she visited Hawks Nest shooting range outside Fort Reynolds. Her silver-rimmed glasses and neat bob haircut completed the look of a community college administrator, which is exactly what she was Monday through Friday. Every Saturday morning, she arrived precisely at 9:15 a.m., signed in politely with a soft-spoken good morning, and paid for 2 hours of range time with cash. She always used lane 7, the farthest from the entrance, where she would meticulously unpack her modest range bag. Unlike the tactical duffels most regulars brought, Margaret's was a repurposed tote bag from a local bookstore. She would set up carefully, taking her time, never rushing. She'd place her pink noise-canceling earmuffs on the shelf, arrange her targets, and only then would she reveal her weapon, a standard Glock 19, nothing customized, nothing fancy. The range instructors barely paid attention to her anymore. She was just another civilian enthusiast, perhaps someone concerned about home protection, they assumed. When new staff came on, veterans would point her out. That's Margaret. Been coming here for years. Nice lady. Always cleans up after herself. And that was the extent of their interest. What they didn't notice was how Margaret shot. They didn't observe her breathing pattern, her stance adjustments, or the consistent grouping of her targets. The instructors were too busy helping newcomers with jammed weapons or correcting dangerous handling mistakes to pay attention to the quiet woman who never needed assistance. If they had looked more closely at her targets before she carefully removed and folded them into her bag, they might have noticed something unusual. "She's like clockwork," said Devin Roberts, the Saturday morning desk attendant. "Never misses a weekend unless there's a blizzard. Never asks questions. Never complains about the coffee. Just does her thing and leaves." Margaret preferred it that way. The anonymity was comforting. Here, she wasn't Dr. Chen, department chair of mathematics at Westridge Community College. She wasn't answering emails from anxious students or attending endless committee meetings. She was just a woman practicing a skill, maintaining a part of herself that most people in her current life knew nothing about. The walls of her modest suburban home held no clues to her past, no shadow boxes with medals, no photographs in uniform. Her colleagues at the college would have been shocked to see the locked cabinet in her basement, its contents meticulously maintained but rarely displayed. Her students would never have guessed that the woman who patiently explained calculus concepts had once calculated trajectories for entirely different purposes. "Do you think you'll ever upgrade your piece?" a young man asked her once, gesturing toward her Glock while showing off his own heavily modified handgun. "This baby's got an enhanced trigger, custom grips, and an extended barrel. Makes a world of difference." Margaret had smiled politely. "I'm comfortable with what I have," she replied. "I'm too old to learn new tricks." The young man had chuckled condescendingly and moved on to more receptive audiences. She didn't mind. She preferred being underestimated. The instructors at Hawks Nest treated civilian shooters with varying degrees of patience. Most were former military or law enforcement themselves, and some barely concealed their disdain for hobbyists. They were particularly dismissive of women who came in wearing pink shooting gloves and matching earmuffs, expecting them to flinch at recoil or struggle with basic safety protocols. Margaret had overheard their comments about soccer moms playing Rambo and weekend warriors who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. She never reacted, never corrected them, never demonstrated anything beyond basic competence. When they gave her unsolicited advice, she would nod appreciatively and thank them, even when the guidance was fundamentally flawed. "You should really lean forward more," an instructor named Brett had told her once, demonstrating an aggressive stance that would have compromised stability for rapid follow-up shots. "Gives you better control." "Thank you," she'd replied. "I'll try that sometime." She never did. What the staff at Hawk's Nest didn't know was that Margaret had been handling firearms since she was 19 years old. They didn't know about the thousands of hours of training, the specialized courses, or the situations where her life had depended on her accuracy. They didn't know that her seemingly ordinary Glock had been meticulously maintained and fired over 50,000 rounds under her ownership. They didn't know that she could field strip it blindfolded in under 20 seconds. Most importantly, they didn't know who she used to be before she became Margaret Chen, mathematics department chair with a passion for gardening and mystery novels. The range had a wall of honor near the entrance, photographs of local law enforcement, military personnel, and competitive shooters who trained there. Margaret would glance at it sometimes, recognizing types if not individuals. She knew the look in their eyes, the way they carried themselves. She understood the weight they carried, visible only to those who had borne similar burdens. One photograph had recently appeared that caught her attention. A team of naval special warfare operators, faces carefully blurred but postures unmistakable. The caption read, "SEAL Team 8, training at Hawk's Nest, 2023. Something about their positioning, the way they held their weapons, stirred memories she typically kept carefully contained. "Impressive bunch, aren't they?" The comment came from Tony, the range's owner, who had noticed her studying the photograph. "They come through occasionally for specialized training, real professionals." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had nodded. "They look very capable." "Capable?" Tony had laughed. "They're the best of the best. Not like our usual weekend warriors." He hadn't intended it as an insult to her specifically, but the implication was clear. Civilian enthusiasts, especially ones who looked like community college administrators, were in an entirely different category. That Saturday in October began like any other. Margaret arrived at 9:15, signed in, and set up at Lane 7. The range was busier than usual, a tactical shooting course scheduled for later that morning. She noticed more instructors milling about, checking equipment and reviewing materials. They barely glanced her way. She was halfway through her session when a group entered the range area. 8 men in civilian clothes, but with unmistakable military bearing. They moved differently than ordinary people, eyes constantly scanning, postures alert even in apparent relaxation. Behind them walked a man with silver hair and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to command. Margaret recognized the type immediately and felt a twinge of something between respect and wariness. The silver-haired man spoke briefly with Tony, who gestured toward the far end of the range where lanes had been reserved. As the group moved past Margaret's position, she kept her focus downrange, not turning to look. She sensed rather than saw one of them pause briefly, but she continued her methodical practice, placing shots exactly where she intended. "We'll be running some specialized drills," Tony announced to the regular patrons. "Nothing to worry about, but you might notice different shooting patterns. Please maintain normal safety protocols." He seemed energized by the presence of the special guests, proud that they had chosen his facility. Margaret continued her routine, aware of the group setting up several lanes down from her position. Their equipment was top tier but understated. Professional rather than showy. They spoke in low voices, occasionally using terminology that would have been meaningless to most civilians, but which she understood perfectly. 40 minutes later, she had completed her planned session. She removed her target, folded it carefully as always, and began to pack her equipment. As she cleaned her station, she could hear the instructors talking excitedly with the military group, their tone noticeably more respectful than when addressing regular patrons. The range had begun to fill with participants for the tactical course. They were mostly men in their 20s and 30s, wearing gun-themed t-shirts and tactical pants, eager to learn techniques from the range's instructors. Margaret recognized several regular weekend shooters among them, including the young man who had recommended she upgrade her Glock. She might have left without incident, as she did every Saturday, if not for what happened next. As she was signing, out at the front desk, a commotion erupted on the range floor. Through the glass partition, she could see one of the course participants had violated safety protocols, turning with a loaded weapon and sweeping across several positions. An instructor was loudly reprimanding him while others ensured the situation was contained. "This is why civilians shouldn't play with firearms they don't understand," muttered Brett, the instructor who had once tried to correct Margaret's stance. He was standing near the desk, watching the incident. "Half these people think they're operators because they bought the right pants and watched some YouTube videos. Not everyone lacks proper training," Margaret said quietly, surprising herself. She rarely engaged with the staff beyond basic pleasantries. Brett looked at her with barely concealed amusement. "With all due respect, ma'am, there's a difference between plinking at paper targets and understanding tactical firearms use. These weekend warriors think they're ready for anything because they can hit a stationary target at 7 yards. Before Margaret could respond, the silver-haired man from the military group emerged from the range area. "Problem?" he asked, his voice carrying natural authority. "Just discussing the difference between civilian shooting and professional training, Commander," Brett replied, straightening slightly in the presence of someone he clearly respected. The commander's eyes shifted to Margaret, then back to Brett. "And your conclusion?" Brett gestured vaguely toward the range. "Just that there's a world of difference between hobby shooting and operational experience. No offense to the civilians who come here," he added with a glance at Margaret. "Interesting perspective," the commander said. He extended his hand to Margaret. "Commander James Reeves, retired. Don't believe we've met." "Margaret Chen," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that seemed to surprise him slightly. "Just finishing up my weekly practice." Something in his expression changed, subtle but definite. "Chun," he repeated, "from Westridge Community College?" Margaret nodded, surprised. "Yes, I teach mathematics there." Brett looked between them, confused by the commander's apparent interest in the unassuming woman he'd seen every Saturday for years without a second thought. "Gentlemen," Commander Reeves addressed the instructors who had gathered nearby, "I believe introductions are in order." He turned to Margaret. "Unless you'd prefer to maintain your privacy, Dr. Chun." Margaret studied him for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "It's been a long time, Commander. I doubt anyone here would recognize my former role." "I recognized you," he said simply. Brett looked increasingly confused. "Commander, you know Ms. Chun?" "Not personally," Commander Reeves replied, "but by reputation, absolutely." He turned to the group of instructors. "While you've been offering unsolicited advice to Dr. Chen here, you've been in the presence of one of the most accomplished marksmen the Naval Special Warfare community has ever worked with." A silence fell over the assembled staff. Margaret stood quietly, her expression neutral, though something had changed in her posture, a subtle shift from the unassuming civilian to something more composed, more present. 20 years ago," Commander Reeves continued, "before most of you were in service, there was a specialized program called Phantom Scope. It trained a small, elite group of precision specialists who operated alongside Special Forces units in group of precision specialists who operated alongside specialists who operated alongside Special Forces units in Kumtsu. Situations requiring exceptional accuracy under impossible conditions." Brett's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. He looked at Margaret, her cardigan, her modest demeanor, her unremarkable appearance, and clearly couldn't reconcile the commander's words with the woman who had been quietly using Lane 7 for years. Dr. Chen here, Commander Reeves said, was known by a different name then. She was referred to as Echo in mission reports. Her confirmed operation distance record stood unbroken for 11 years. Tony, the range owner, stared at Margaret with dawning recognition. Wait, Echo? The ghost of Fallujah Echo? Margaret adjusted her glasses slightly. That was a long time ago, she said quietly. Another life. The young tactical course participants had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual conversation. They looked at Margaret with confused expressions, unable to connect this unassuming woman with whatever the commander was implying. Perhaps a demonstration would be more effective than explanations, Commander Reeves suggested. He looked at Margaret. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Chen, for educational purposes. Margaret hesitated. She had spent 15 years carefully constructing her new identity, her quiet life. She taught calculus. She tended her garden. She graded papers on weeknights. The person the commander was describing existed now only in classified reports and the memories of a very few individuals. But something in Commander Reeves' respectful request, and perhaps in the dismissive attitudes she had silently endured for years, made her nod once. One demonstration, she agreed. Then I really need to get home. I have papers to grade. Commander Reeves smiled. Lane 8 is set up for our distance drill. Would that be acceptable? Margaret followed him back onto the range floor, aware of the instructors and course participants trailing behind, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. The commander's team members had paused their own training, watching with interest. Lane 8 had been configured differently than the standard lanes. The target was positioned at the maximum distance the indoor range allowed, and it was significantly smaller than standard practice targets. Even experienced shooters would find it challenging. Standard qualification or something more interesting? Commander Reeves asked. Let's not be dramatic, Margaret replied. She removed her cardigan, folding it neatly and setting it aside. The simple action somehow transformed her appearance. Her shoulders squared, her stance shifted. Even without changing clothes or equipment, she suddenly looked different. She declined the offer of a weapon from the commander's team. I'll use my own, thank you. She retrieved her Glock from her bag, the same unremarkable pistol the range staff had seen hundreds of times. Brett couldn't contain himself. Commander, with all due respect, that's a basic civilian handgun. Your team has match-grade equipment. Watch and learn, was all Commander Reeves said. Margaret stepped up to Lane 8. She rolled her shoulders once, then grew completely still. The range instructors, accustomed to watching shooters of all skill levels, immediately noticed the change. Her breathing pattern altered, becoming measured and controlled. Her grip on the weapon was textbook perfect, but with subtle adjustments that spoke of extensive experience. Without ceremony, she fired 6 rounds in rapid succession. The sound was sharp and precise, the timing between shots remarkably consistent. She lowered the weapon, engaged the safety, and placed it on the shelf. May I? Commander Reeves asked. Indicating the target return system, Margaret nodded. When the target reached them, a murmur ran through the gathered crowd. 6 holes formed a tight cluster directly centered on the smallest scoring ring, a grouping that would have been impressive at half the distance, let alone at the range's maximum. Holy shit, one of the younger instructors said, then immediately apologized for his language. Commander Reeves turned to the group. Dr. Chen was part of a program that trained specialists to operate in environments where traditional sniper teams couldn't be deployed. She has over 300 confirmed operations in support of special forces units across 4 theaters. That's not possible, Brett said, still staring at the target. That level of accuracy with a standard Glock at this distance. The weapon is merely a tool, Margaret said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that hadn't been present before. It's the operator that matters. She turned to Commander Reeves. May I ask how you recognized me? My involvement with Phantom Scope was classified. I was on the receiving end of your support in Kandahar, 2006, he replied. Never saw your face, but I was briefed on your call sign after you eliminated 4 threats that had my team pinned down during an extraction. Your shot placement was memorable. When I saw your name on the sign-in sheet today, I wondered if it could be the same person. Tony was staring at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. You've been coming here for 5 years, and you never said anything. Why would I? Margaret asked simply. I'm retired. I teach mathematics now. But you could have. Brett gestured helplessly. I don't know, taught courses here. Shared your experience. Margaret began packing her equipment with the same methodical care she always showed. My experience isn't something I care to revisit regularly, Mr. Brett. I come here to maintain a skill, not to relive the circumstances in which I used it. The gathered crowd watched in silence as she zipped her range bag and put her cardigan back on, transforming once again into the unassuming college professor they had always seen. If you gentlemen will excuse me, she said, I really do have papers to grade. She nodded to Commander Reeves. Commander, it was an unexpected pleasure to meet someone from that chapter of my life. I trust you'll use discretion regarding my background. Of course, Dr. Chen, he replied with respect, evident in his tone. Though I hope you realize these gentlemen will never look at you the same way again. A small smile touched Margaret's lips. I suppose not, but perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. She addressed the range instructors directly. The next time you see someone you consider just a weekend warrior or a soccer mom playing Rambo, remember that appearances can be deceiving. Experience doesn't always announce itself with tactical gear and war stories. With that, she shouldered her modest range bag and walked out, leaving behind a group of thoroughly chastened instructors and wide-eyed tactical course participants. As the door closed behind her, one of Commander Reeves' team members whistled. Softly, I served with Phantom Scope specialists twice, he said. Never knew who they were, just voices on comms and perfectly placed shots when we needed them most. They called them guardian angels in my unit. And she's been here every Saturday, using a lane right next to tactical courses where instructors were teaching proper technique. Tony shook his head in disbelief. Brett was still staring at the target with its impossibly tight grouping. I tried to correct her stance, he said, his voice hollow with embarrassment. I actually tried to. Tell Echo how to shoot better. Commander Reeves clapped him on the shoulder. Consider it a valuable lesson, son. The most dangerous people in the room are rarely the ones wearing all the gear and telling war stories. He glanced toward the door where Margaret had exited. They're the quiet ones who have nothing to prove. Monday morning at Westridge Community College arrived with its usual rhythm. Students hurried across campus clutching coffee cups, professors reviewed notes before lectures, and administrative staff prepared for the week ahead. In room 237 of the mathematics building, Dr. Margaret Chen wrote equations on the whiteboard with precise, measured strokes. Her students watched attentively as she explained the principles of differential calculus, her voice calm and methodical. The key to understanding these concepts, she told her class, is recognizing patterns within complexity. Mathematics isn't about memorizing formulas. It's about developing the ability to see structure where others see only chaos. Her students scribbled notes furiously. Dr. Chen had a reputation for being demanding but fair. Her tests challenging but never impossible. What they didn't realize was that her teaching philosophy had been shaped by experiences far removed from academia. As class ended, a young woman approached her desk. Dr. Chen, I'm struggling with the application problems. Do you have any additional office hours this week? Margaret smiled. Of course, Emily. Thursday afternoon works if that suits you. Thank you, Emily replied, relief evident in her voice. I'm trying to maintain my GPA for medical school applications, and your class is honestly the most challenging one I'm taking. You'll get there, Margaret assured her. The precision you're developing now will serve you well in medicine. Details matter when lives are at stake. Emily thanked her again and left, unaware of the depth behind her professor's words. Margaret gathered her materials, her movements efficient without appearing hurried. As she walked through the campus toward her office, several colleagues greeted her with the casual familiarity of people who believed they knew her well. "Morning, Margaret. Ready for the curriculum committee meeting tomorrow?" "Dr. Chen, did you see the email about the STEM funding proposal?" "Margaret, are you bringing those amazing cookies to the department potluck?" She responded appropriately to each interaction, professional, pleasant, but maintaining the careful distance she had cultivated over 15 years at Westridge. Her colleagues respected her as a dedicated educator and competent administrator. They invited her to social gatherings, which she occasionally attended. They considered her a valued team member, if somewhat private. None suspected that the woman discussing differential equations and faculty Perkin concerns had once operated in environments where mathematical precision meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. In her office, Margaret checked her email before her next class. Among the usual administrative notices and student questions was a message that made her pause. The sender was Tony Richards, owner of Hawk's Nest Shooting Range. "Dr. Chen, I hope this email finds you well. After Saturday's revelations, I wanted to extend a personal apology for the years of underestimation you've experienced at my facility. Commander Reeves provided some context after your departure, nothing classified, I assure you. I would like to discuss a proposal with you at your convenience. Respectfully, Tony Richards." Margaret stared at the screen for several moments. The events of Saturday had disrupted the careful separation she maintained between her past and present lives. For 15 years, she had been Dr. Margaret Chen, mathematician. The woman known as Echo existed only in redacted mission reports and in the memories of operators she had never officially met. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The display showed Fort Reynolds Command Office. Margaret hesitated, then answered, "Dr. Chen speaking." "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Thomas Barrett, base commander at Fort Reynolds. I understand you had an interesting encounter with Commander Reeves at the local range this weekend." Margaret closed her office door. "News travels fast in certain circles, Colonel." "Indeed it does, especially when it involves someone of your particular background. I was wondering if you might be available to meet this week. There's a situation developing where your expertise could be valuable." "I'm retired, Colonel," Margaret said firmly. "Permanently retired." "I understand completely," Colonel Barrett replied, his tone carefully neutral. "This wouldn't be an operational role. More of a consulting position. A training challenge with one of our specialized units. I teach calculus now. My consulting days are long behind me, of course. But if you change your mind, my office remains at your disposal." He paused. "For what it's worth, Dr. Chen, your work with Phantom Scope saved countless lives, including some under my command in Mosul. We've never forgotten." After the call ended, Margaret sat motionless at her desk. 15 years of careful anonymity had unraveled in a single weekend. The life she had built, predictable, peaceful, purposeful in its own way, suddenly felt precarious. She glanced at the simple framed photograph on her desk, herself with her mathematics department colleagues at last year's holiday gathering. Would they look at her differently if they knew? Would her students see her as Dr. Chun, the professor, or as Echo, the operative? By Wednesday, Margaret knew something had changed at Hawk's Nest. She visited midweek, breaking her Saturday-only routine, and immediately noticed the difference in how the staff interacted with her. Gone was the condescension, replaced by an awkward deference that was almost more uncomfortable. Brett, the instructor who had tried to correct her stance, couldn't meet her eyes as he processed her range fee. "Lane 7 as usual, Dr. Chen?" he asked, his earlier swagger notably absent. "Actually, I'd prefer lane 5 today," she replied, observing his surprise at the change in her routine. As she set up her station, she noticed other patrons watching her with poorly concealed curiosity. Word had clearly spread beyond the immediate witnesses to Saturday's demonstration. She sighed internally but proceeded with her practice session, focusing on the familiar rhythm of controlled breathing and precise movement. Halfway through her session, Tony appeared beside her lane. "Dr. Chen, thank you for coming in today. I was hoping to catch you." He waited until she had safely secured her weapon before continuing. "I wanted to apologize in person for how we've underestimated you all these years. There's no need, Mr. Richards. I never came here seeking recognition. That's becoming clear to me," Tony replied. "But it raises the question, why here? With your background, you could have access to military ranges, specialized facilities." Margaret removed her pink earmuffs. "Because here, I was just another civilian enthusiast. No expectations, no history, no questions about operations I can't discuss. Just a woman maintaining a skill." Tony nodded slowly. "I respect that. But I have a proposal for you. We run specialized courses for law enforcement and security professionals. Having someone with your experience as an instructor would be invaluable." "I don't think that would be appropriate," Margaret said firmly. "I chose to leave that life behind for good reasons." "May I ask why? Someone with your abilities." "Because I've served enough," Margaret interrupted, her voice quiet but with an edge that made Tony straighten involuntarily. 23 years supporting operations across 4 continents. 312 confirmed interventions. "I did my part, Mr. Richards." "Of course," Tony said quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." Margaret softened her tone. "I understand your interest, but teaching civilians tactical shooting isn't something I'm interested in. The skills I developed were for specific circumstances that civilian shooters will never, and should never, encounter." "What about basic marksmanship principles?" "Nothing tactical, just fundamentals." Margaret considered this. "I'll think about it. That's all I can promise." As she prepared to leave, Tony had one more question. "The pink earmuffs and the cardigan, was that all part of the cover?" A small smile touched Margaret's lips. "The earmuffs are excellent quality with superior noise cancellation. The color discourages people from borrowing them. As for the cardigan, I get cold easily. Not everything is tactical deception, Mr. Richards." Thursday brought another disruption to Margaret's carefully structured life. As she arrived at campus, she noticed an unfamiliar black SUV in the faculty parking lot. Her instincts, dulled but not eliminated by 15 years of academic life, immediately registered the vehicle's government plates and the alert posture of the driver who remained inside. In her office, she found Commander Reeves waiting, speaking amicably with the department secretary. "Commander," she greeted him neutrally, "this is unexpected." "Dr. Chen," he replied with a nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." She led him into her office, closing the door behind them. The space was meticulously organized, books arranged by subject and author, papers in neat stacks, a small potted plant on the windowsill. Nothing about it suggested a connection to her previous life. "You've built quite a different world for yourself," Commander Reeves observed, glancing at her academic credentials framed on the wall. "That was the point," Margaret replied. "What can I do for you, Commander? I doubt this is a social call." "No, though I would have preferred it to be." He handed her a sealed envelope. "Colonel Barrett mentioned he reached out to you. This contains the details of the situation he referenced." Margaret didn't take the envelope. As I told the colonel, I'm retired. I understand. But before you refuse completely, you should know this involves Kingfisher. Margaret went completely still. Kingfisher is dead. Killed in Basra, 2008. That's what the official record shows, Commander Reeves agreed. Reality is more complicated. After a long moment, Margaret took the envelope but didn't open it. Why come to me after all this time? Because you were the only member of Phantom Scope who ever went operational against him and survived. The commander leaned forward. We're not asking you to return to field work. We need your insight, your experience with his methods. We have a team training to address the situation, but they need someone who understands what they're facing. Margaret placed the envelope on her desk. I have a class in 20 minutes, Commander. Statistical analysis for engineering students. Of course. The envelope contains secure contact instructions if you decide to help. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Echo, the teens you supported never forgot what you did for them. Even without knowing your name or face, you were legendary among those of us who came home because of you. After he left, Margaret sat motionless, staring at the envelope. Kingfisher. A code name she had hoped never to hear again. The most challenging adversary she had ever faced, a precision specialist like herself, but working for hostile interests. Their final encounter in Basra had nearly cost Margaret her life. The report of his death had finally allowed her to consider retirement, to imagine a life beyond constant vigilance and split-second decisions. If Kingfisher was alive, it changed everything. Her phone chimed with a calendar alert, 15 minutes until class. With practiced discipline, Margaret compartmentalized her thoughts, setting aside the implications of Commander Reeves' visit. She gathered her teaching materials and headed to the lecture hall, outwardly the same composed professor her students expected. As she explained statistical principles to a room full of engineering students, part of her mind processed the implications of Kingfisher's survival. Another part analyzed her options, the potential consequences of becoming involved again versus staying removed. The compartmentalization was a skill she had developed during her operational years, the ability to function perfectly on one level while processing critical information on another. After class, a colleague stopped her in the hallway. "Margaret, are you all right? You seem distracted today." "Just a minor headache," she replied with a reassuring smile. "Nothing serious. Well, don't forget the department meeting at 4. Dean Wilson is discussing the budget cuts." "I'll be there," Margaret promised, already knowing she would need to review the secure materials first. Some priorities transcended academic politics. In her office with the door locked, Margaret finally opened the envelope. Inside was a secure tablet with biometric authentication. Her fingerprint unlocked it immediately. Her biometrics were still in the system after all these years. The files contained surveillance photos, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments, all centered around a figure she had hoped never to encounter again. Kingfisher. The file used his real name now, Victor Kask, Estonian-born, former military specialist turned mercenary. The man who had nearly killed her in Basra had aged, his hair now gray at the temples, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, precise. The intelligence assessment detailed his suspected involvement in recent precision operations against American interests abroad. A message appeared on the screen. Initial briefing scheduled at Fort Reynolds, Secure Facility Bravo, 2,000 hours tonight. Confirmation required. Margaret stared at the message, the weight of the past pressing against the life she had built. She had left Echo behind, had crafted a new identity as thoroughly as any deep-cover operative. Dr. Margaret Chen had no connection to clandestine operations or classified programs. She attended faculty meetings and graded calculus exams. She tended her garden and read mystery novels. But if Kingfisher was operational again, The department meeting passed in a blur of budget discussions and curriculum debates. Margaret contributed appropriately when required, but her mind was elsewhere, processing scenarios and calculating risks. When the meeting ended, she declined an invitation to join colleagues for dinner, citing preparation for tomorrow's classes. In her modest home, Margaret opened the locked cabinet in her basement for the first time in months. Inside were not just firearms, but specialized equipment she had maintained out of habit: communications gear, optical devices, and items most civilians wouldn't recognize as operational tools. She had kept them not out of nostalgia but from the ingrained caution of someone who understood that retirement from certain roles was never guaranteed to be permanent. At 7:30 p.m., she changed from her professional attire into more practical clothing. Nothing tactical, nothing that would draw attention, but clothes that allowed freedom of movement and concealed the shoulder holster she had not worn in 15 years. The familiar weight of it felt both foreign and natural, like returning to a language not spoken for years, but never truly forgotten. At Fort Reynolds, the guard at the security checkpoint examined her ID with initial confusion. Dr. Margaret Chen, mathematics professor, was not in his database of authorized personnel. A phone call changed his expression to one of carefully concealed surprise. Whatever he was told about her clearance level was sufficient to wave her through with newfound respect. Secure Facility Bravo was unmarked, indistinguishable from other administrative buildings on base. Inside, Margaret was escorted through multiple security checkpoints, each more rigorous than the last. The final door required both her biometric verification and the security officer's separate authorization. The room beyond contained a small group of people: Colonel Barrett, Commander Reeves, and 4 operators whose specific unit affiliations were not identified, but whose bearing marked them as special operations personnel. Their expressions as she entered ranged from curiosity to skepticism. "Dr. Chen, thank you for coming," Colonel Barrett greeted her formally. "I haven't agreed to anything yet, Colonel," Margaret replied. "I'm here to understand the situation more completely." "Of course." He gestured to the secure briefing materials displayed on the room's screens. "Commander Reeves will lead the briefing." For the next 40 minutes, Commander Reeves detailed intelligence about Victor Kask's recent activities and the threat assessment associated with his reemergence. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing, as photos and reports documented the operations attributed to Kingfisher. 3 precision interventions in the past 18 months, Commander Reeves concluded, all targeting key personnel involved in counter-terrorism operations, all executed with the same methodical approach you documented in your encounter with him in Basra. "If these interventions match his methodology, he's improved," Margaret observed, speaking for the first time since the briefing began. The operational parameters in the 3rd incident exceeded his previous capabilities. One of the operators, a woman with the intense focus Margaret recognized from her own mirror years ago, leaned forward. "You're certain it's the same individual? Couldn't this be someone using similar methods?" "The shot placement pattern is distinctive," Margaret replied. "Kingfisher, Kask, has a mathematical approach to his work. He solves precision problems with specific formulaic solutions. These interventions show his signature, especially in how he accounts for environmental variables." "That's exactly why we need your insight, Dr. Chen," Colonel Barrett said. "You're the only person who has directly countered his methods and understood his approach well enough to anticipate his actions." Margaret studied the tactical team more carefully. "You're planning an interdiction. Intelligence suggests he'll be operational in Belgrade within the next 3 weeks," Commander Reeves confirmed. "We have authorization to intercept." "And you want me to, what, join the operation?" Her tone made it clear how unlikely she considered that possibility. "No," Colonel Barrett said quickly. "We want you to train this team. Help them understand what they're facing. Your experience with cask is unique and invaluable." Margaret looked at the 4 operators. Their expressions remained professional, but she recognized the subtle indicators of skepticism. They saw a middle-aged math professor, not the operative she had once been. She couldn't blame them. The disconnect between Dr. Chen and Echo was precisely what she had cultivated for 15 years. "I need to consider this carefully," she said finally. "This isn't a simple consulting arrangement. If I help prepare your team for Kingfisher, I'm responsible for their safety in ways that go beyond typical training." "We understand, Commander," Reeves said, "but time is limited. The intelligence window is closing." Margaret stood. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow. I need to review the complete intelligence package first." As she turned to leave, one of the male operators spoke. "With all due respect, ma'am, how do we know your information is still relevant? Operational methods evolve. What was true 15 years ago may not apply today." Margaret paused. Fair question, Lieutenant." She had noted his rank from his demeanor rather than any visible insignia. Principles remain constant even when techniques evolve. Kingfisher approaches precision problems mathematically. Understanding his formula is the key to countering it. That hasn't changed, even if his equipment has improved. "Mathematics, ma'am." Another operator sounded skeptical. "Everything is mathematics," Margaret replied simply. "Trajectory, windage, timing, position. These are all mathematical problems. Kingfisher solves them one way. I solve them differently. That's why. I survived our encounter when others didn't." As she left the secure facility, Margaret felt the weight of the past pressing against her carefully constructed present. For 15 years, she had been Dr. Chen, mathematician and educator. Now Echo was re-emerging, called back by circumstances she had hoped would never materialize. In her car, she sat motionless for several minutes before starting the engine. The decision facing her wasn't just about consulting on a single operation. It was about acknowledging that part of herself she had tried to leave behind, the part that calculated kill probabilities instead of test scores, that measured success in mission objectives rather than student comprehension. As she drove home through the quiet evening, Margaret considered what her students would think if they knew their meticulous calculus professor had once applied mathematical principles to entirely different problems. Would they see her differently? Would they understand that the precision she demanded in their equations had been honed in environments where precision meant survival? By the time she reached her modest home, Margaret had made her decision. Some skills, once developed, created an obligation that transcended personal preference. If her knowledge could prevent Kingfisher from killing again, she couldn't justify withholding it, regardless of how desperately she wanted to remain solely Dr. Chen, mathematics department chair, whose greatest daily challenge was departmental budget allocations. Tomorrow she would agree to train the tactical team, but she would do so as Dr. Margaret Chen, consultant and analyst, not as Echo. That identity belonged to another life, one she had deliberately set aside. The distinction might seem semantic to others, but to Margaret, it represented the careful balance she had maintained for 15 years between who she had been and who she had chosen to become. The next morning, Margaret arrived at her office earlier than usual. She had emailed the department chair requesting a 2-week personal leave, citing a family emergency. The fabrication felt uncomfortable. In 15 years at Westridge, she had rarely taken time off and never lied about her reasons. But the situation warranted extraordinary measures. She was arranging substitute coverage for her classes when her office phone rang. The caller ID showed Westridge President's Office. "Dr. Chen speaking. Margaret, it's President Harlow. Do you have a moment to come to my office?" 20 minutes later, Margaret sat across from Elaine Harlow, the university president she had worked with for nearly a decade. The president's office was elegant but understated, reflecting its occupants' practical approach to leadership. "Margaret, I received a rather unusual call this morning," President Harlow began. "A colonel, Barrett from Fort Reynolds, informed me that your expertise is needed for a time-sensitive government consultation." He was deliberately vague about details but emphasized national security implications. Margaret kept her expression neutral. "I was going to discuss this with you after arranging coverage for my classes." "This is rather unexpected, President," Harlow noted. "In all your years here, you've never mentioned consulting for the military." "It relates to work I did before coming to Westridge," Margaret explained carefully. "Specialized analysis that's suddenly relevant again." "President." Harlow studied her with newfound curiosity. "The colonel spoke of you with remarkable deference. He mentioned your clearance level exceeds his own, which I found particularly interesting, given that I've known you as our mathematics department chair for 10 years. Margaret remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. He also assured me that your temporary absence would be considered a matter of national service, with commensurate compensation to both you and the college. President Harlow leaned forward. "Margaret, clearly there's more to your background than your CV suggests. My work at Westridge has never been compromised by my previous experience," Margaret said carefully. "I never suggested it was." The president's expression softened. "Whatever you did before, whatever you're being asked to do now, it must be important for a base commander to call me directly." "It is," President Harlow nodded. "Take the time you need. Your classes will be covered. Just—" She hesitated. "Come back to us, Margaret. You're too valuable to lose permanently." The genuine concern in her voice caught Margaret by surprise. In her determination to keep her past separate from her present, she had sometimes overlooked the real connections she had formed at Westridge. "Thank you, Elaine. I have every intention of returning. This is my life now." As Margaret left the president's office, she realized that her carefully compartmentalized worlds were beginning to bleed together. For 15 years, she had been Dr. Chen, mathematician, with Echo locked securely away in classified files and the disciplined corners of her mind. Now those boundaries were eroding, forcing her to navigate between identities she had intended to keep forever separate. At Fort Reynolds that afternoon, Margaret arrived at the specialized training facility designated for her work with the tactical team. She had exchanged her usual professional attire for more practical clothing, dark pants, a simple button-down shirt, and boots that had spent years in her closet, but still fit perfectly. The familiar weight of her sidearm in its shoulder holster was both foreign and natural, like returning to a childhood language long unused, but never truly forgotten. The facility contained an indoor range, simulation rooms, and planning areas with advanced technology that made Margaret inwardly marvel at how equipment had evolved since her active days. Commander Reeves met her at the entrance. "The team is assembled and ready for your assessment, Dr. Chen." "I'm not here to assess them, Commander. I'm here to prepare them for a specific adversary, of course. But they need to understand that your insights come from direct operational experience. A demonstration might help establish the appropriate foundation." Margaret recognized the diplomatic phrasing. The tactical team, elite operators in their own right, needed to see evidence of her capabilities before they would fully accept her guidance. Fair enough. The 4 operators were waiting in the main training room. Margaret recognized them from the previous day's briefing, but now noted details she had previously overlooked. 2 men, 2 women, all with the coiled readiness of people accustomed to high-stakes environments. Their expressions ranged from professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism. "Dr. Chen will be leading this specialized preparation for the Belgrade operation," Commander Reeves announced. "She has unique insights into Kingfisher's methodologies and operational patterns." "With respect, ma'am," one of the male operators began, "our team has extensive experience with counter-sniper operations. We've studied the Belgrade parameters thoroughly." Margaret noted his name tag, Hayes. Lieutenant Hayes, Have you ever encountered an adversary who approaches precision work as a mathematical equation rather than a physical skill? The question caught him off guard. I'm not sure I follow. Most precision specialists work from a physical foundation, breath control, trigger discipline, positional awareness. They develop an intuitive feel for environmental factors. Kingfisher is different. He calculates variables with mathematical precision. His approach is algorithmic. All snipers calculate variables, the other male operator noted. Martinez, according to his tag. Not like this, Margaret replied. She turned to the tactical planning station and pulled up the Belgrade schematics. May I? Commander Reeves nodded, and Margaret accessed the system with surprising familiarity. Despite the updated interface, she quickly input parameters, creating a simulation of the expected operational environment. Kingfisher will choose his position based on mathematical optimization, not tactical convenience. Traditional counter-sniper operations focus on identifying the most advantageous firing positions. That won't work with him. Her fingers moved rapidly across the interface. He'll solve for multiple variables simultaneously, not just ballistic considerations, but also extraction probability, countermeasures, and time horizons. She highlighted 3 locations on the schematic that hadn't been flagged in the team's initial assessment. These positions are suboptimal from a traditional perspective. Limited visibility, challenging angles, restricted egress options. But they represent mathematical solutions to the overall problem Kingfisher is trying to solve. One of the female operators, Wilson, stepped closer to examine the highlighted positions. These would be incredibly difficult shots. Difficulty is subjective, Margaret replied. From a pure mathematics perspective, these positions optimize his complete operational equation. She turned to face the team directly. Kingfisher doesn't think like a conventional operator. He thinks like a mathematician solving for multiple variables. That's why conventional countermeasures have failed against him. Lieutenant Hayes still looked unconvinced. With all due respect, Dr. Chen, theory is valuable, but this operation requires practical field experience. The kind that's current and relevant to today's operational realities. Margaret recognized the underlying message. To this team, she was an academic, a consultant who might have had field experience decades ago, but who now spent her days explaining calculus to undergraduates. Her credibility gap was understandable, but potentially dangerous given what they were facing. Commander Reeves seemed to sense the tension. Perhaps a practical demonstration would be helpful. He gestured toward the adjacent training range. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to run through simulation protocol Echo 7 with the team? It might provide useful context. The designation wasn't coincidental. Echo 7 was a specialized counter-sniper scenario designed to test advanced precision skills under complex conditions. Margaret hadn't run such a simulation in 15 years. But she nodded calmly. Of course, Commander. The team moved to the simulation range, which was configured with multiple target systems at varying distances and environmental challenge factors. Margaret noted the skeptical glances exchanged among the operators as she prepared. They expected the academic to embarrass herself. Standard qualification parameters? She asked Commander Reeves. Let's make it interesting, he replied. Full environmental variables, moving targets, counter-position indicators. In other words, the most challenging configuration possible. Margaret suppressed a smile. The commander was setting the stage for maximum impact. She selected a standard issue rifle from the equipment rack rather than one of the specialized precision weapons. Another calculated choice, demonstrating proficiency with basic equipment, would make a stronger impression than relying on advanced technology. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Chen, Commander Reeves said, activating the simulation system. Margaret took position at the firing line. The operators watched with professional curiosity but clear skepticism. She took a moment to familiarize herself with the weapon, checking its balance and sighting. Then she grew completely still. The change was subtle but unmistakable to trained observers. Her breathing pattern shifted, her posture adjusted microscopically, and her focus narrowed with laser intensity. The mathematics professor disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. The simulation began with targets appearing at varying distances under changing environmental conditions. Margaret engaged each one with methodical precision, her shots finding center mass with consistent accuracy despite the challenging parameters. As the simulation progressed, the difficulty increased: moving targets, partial visual obstruction, simulated environmental interference. Through it all, Margaret maintained the same focused calm, adjusting for variables with mathematical precision. Her shooting wasn't just accurate, it was calculated. Each shot placed exactly where it needed to be with an efficiency of movement that spoke of thousands of hours of specialized training. When the final target fell and the simulation ended, silence filled the range. The operators stared at the performance metrics displayed on the monitoring system, a perfect score under maximum difficulty conditions. Even for elite operators, such performance was exceptional. For someone they had dismissed as an academic consultant, it was revelatory. Lieutenant Hayes broke the silence. "That was impressive, ma'am." "It's been a while," Margaret admitted, returning the rifle to the rack with the same careful attention she had given it initially. "The principles remain the same, even if the technology has evolved." Commander Reeves allowed himself a small smile. "Dr. Chen holds the record for this particular simulation protocol. Has for 15 years, despite numerous attempts to surpass it." Wilson, who had been studying the performance metrics with particular attention, looked up. "You weren't just operational, were you? You were something else entirely." "Phantom." "Scope was a specialized program," Margaret acknowledged, offering the minimum necessary information. "We provided precision support under complex conditions when conventional assets weren't viable." "You were a ghost," Martinez said with new respect in his voice. "The kind of asset that doesn't officially exist, but somehow always delivers when everything else fails." Margaret neither confirmed nor denied. "Let's focus on the task at hand. You're facing an adversary with a unique approach to precision work. Understanding his methodology is critical to countering it effectively." The demonstration had achieved its purpose. The skepticism had vanished, replaced by focused attention as Margaret began detailing Kingfisher's operational patterns. Using the simulation system, she created scenarios that illustrated his particular approach to precision problems. "He calculates multiple variables simultaneously," she explained, demonstrating through the tactical interface. "Environmental factors, timing considerations, countermeasure probabilities. He processes these as a unified mathematical problem rather than separate tactical considerations." "How do you counter someone who approaches operations that way?" Wilson asked. "By introducing variables he can't easily calculate," Margaret replied. "Uncertainty is his weakness. His mathematical approach requires reliable inputs. If you can disrupt his calculations, introduce factors he can't readily quantify, his advantage diminishes significantly." For the next several hours, Margaret guided the team through increasingly complex scenarios, demonstrating Kingfisher's likely approaches and potential counter-strategies. The operators proved exceptionally capable, absorbing her insights and applying them with impressive adaptability. As the initial training session concluded, Commander Reeves pulled Margaret aside. "They're responding well to your guidance. Better than I anticipated, frankly." "They're excellent operators," Margaret acknowledged. "Quick to adapt, open to new perspectives once the initial skepticism was addressed. Will they be ready for Belgrade?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "They have the technical skills and tactical awareness. What concerns me is Kingfisher's adaptability. He learns from each encounter, adjusts his calculations accordingly. The Belgrade parameters suggest he's anticipating countermeasures based on historical patterns, which is why your insight is invaluable. You're the variable he can't fully calculate. Perhaps, Margaret conceded, but I won't be in Belgrade. Commander Reeves studied her with thoughtful consideration. No, but your knowledge will be. That may be sufficient to disrupt his equations. As Margaret prepared to leave the facility, Lieutenant Hayes approached her. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by professional respect. Dr. Chen, the team would like to continue working through scenario variations this evening. Would you be available to observe and provide feedback? The request represented a significant shift in their perception of her value. Margaret nodded. Of course, Lieutenant. I'll return after dinner. Thank you, ma'am. He hesitated. If I may ask, how did you transition from operational work to teaching mathematics? The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Margaret considered her response carefully. Mathematics was always my foundation, she finally said. The operational application was circumstantial, driven by necessity rather than preference. Teaching allows me to share the foundational principles without the life or death consequences. Do you miss it? The operational work? Margaret thought about the peaceful rhythm of her classroom, the satisfaction of watching students grasp complex concepts, the simple pleasure of discussing theoretical problems with no blood on the line. I miss the clarity, she admitted. In operational environments, objectives are precise, success metrics unambiguous. Academia is more nuanced, more subjective in many ways. She smiled slightly. But I don't miss the consequences of failure. Hayes nodded with understanding. I can see that. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, ma'am. It's not what we expected, but exactly what we needed. As Hayes rejoined his team, Margaret found Commander Reeves watching the exchange. With interest. You've made quite an impression, he observed. When we first discussed bringing you in, the team arrived 12 hours ago and has established preliminary positions. Target confirmation expected within the next 24 hours. He gestured toward a specialized workstation that had been configured according to specifications. She had provided, your support platform is ready. Lieutenant Wilson will be your primary field contact. Margaret examined the system, a sophisticated integration of tactical feeds, environmental monitoring, and analytical tools specifically designed for mathematical modeling of precision operations. The interface was more advanced than anything available during her active service, but the underlying principles were familiar. When did Kingfisher last surface? She asked, activating the system with her credentials. Facial recognition tagged him at a cafe near the Parliament building. Yesterday afternoon. Intelligence suggests he's in final preparation phase for an operation targeting the security summit. Margaret nodded, accessing the intelligence feeds. Has he established a pattern yet? Reconnaissance routes, timing intervals? Limited. Data. He's being exceptionally cautious. Colonel Barrett displayed surveillance footage showing a gray-haired man moving through a crowded market. Nothing about him would draw attention. His clothing, posture, and demeanor designed for maximum anonymity. But Margaret recognized the mathematical precision in his movement pattern, the calculated efficiency in his environmental scanning. That's him, she confirmed. He's already mapping variables, timing patterns, security rotations, civilian density fluctuations. His operational calculations have begun. How can you be certain from such limited observation? His pattern indicates systematic data collection rather than casual movement. He's establishing baseline metrics for his operational equations. Margaret studied the footage with focused intensity. He's more thorough than before. His Basra operation showed 18 distinct calculation points. This suggests he's expanded to 24 or more. For the next several hours, Margaret immersed herself in the operational data, constructing mathematical models of Kingfisher's likely calculations. The command center staff observed with fascination as she transformed surveillance footage and environmental data into complex equations that predicted potential positioning and timing variables. When Lieutenant Wilson established communication from the field, Margaret was ready. Echo Base to Talon 1. Preliminary modeling complete. Uploading potential position calculations now. Receiving upload, Echo Base, Wilson's voice replied. Through the secure channel. These are different from our initial assessments. Kingfisher doesn't use conventional tactical positioning, Margaret explained. He optimizes mathematical variables rather than tactical advantage. Note calculation set 3. Those positions sacrifice optimal firing angles for superior calculation. Stability across environmental variables. Understood. Repositioning surveillance assets accordingly. As the tactical team adjusted their deployment based on Margaret's insights, Colonel Barrett observed her work with newfound appreciation. I've seen many analysts model adversary behavior, Dr. Chen, but never with this level of precision. It's not about predicting what he'll do, Margaret replied, still focused on her calculations. It's about understanding how he thinks. Kingfisher approaches operations as mathematical problems to be solved. His variables include not just physical factors, but probability calculations across multiple scenarios. And you understand this because you think the same way. Margaret paused. Briefly, we share a foundational approach but apply it differently. His equations optimize for target elimination regardless of collateral impact. Mine always factored in minimizing secondary effects. A critical distinction, the colonel noted. The fuzzy most important one, Margaret agreed, returning to her analysis. Throughout the night, she refined her models as new intelligence arrived, communicating regularly with the field team as they established counter positions based on her calculations. The rhythm was familiar, the focused intensity, the mathematical precision, the critical evaluation of emerging variables. For all the years that had passed, this part of her had remained intact, like a language not spoken, but never forgotten. At dawn, activity in the command center intensified. Intelligence confirmed that the security summit would proceed as scheduled, with high-value participants arriving throughout the day. If Kingfisher maintained his historical pattern, he would execute his operation during the arrival phase when security was most strained by multiple simultaneous movements. Echo Base to all Talon units, Margaret transmitted. Sunrise brings new environmental variables. Uploading adjusted calculations. Note particularly the changed wind patterns affecting calculation sets 2 and 4. Copy that, Echo Base. Lieutenant Hayes responded, adjusting positions. Visibility improving with morning light. Margaret studied the tactical displays showing team positions relative to her calculated threat points. They had established excellent coverage based on her models, positioning countermeasures precisely where Kingfisher would most likely operate. But something felt incomplete in her analysis, a variable she hadn't fully accounted for. Colonel, she said, motioning Barrett to her workstation, I need to review Kingfisher's recent operational history again. Something isn't aligning with his established pattern. The colonel provided access to the complete intelligence file. Margaret studied the details of Kingfisher's 3 recent operations, comparing methodologies and approach patterns. Halfway through the 3rd file, she identified the anomaly. He's evolved his methodology, she said, recalculating rapidly. His recent operations show a secondary calculation set, a contingency approach that activates if primary calculations are disrupted. Meaning, he anticipates countermeasures now. If his primary approach is compromised, he shifts to an entirely different mathematical model. Margaret's fingers moved swiftly across the interface. We need to account for this in our positioning. She transmitted updated calculations to the field team, explaining the revised approach. Kingfisher now operates with dual mathematical models. If he detects counter-positioning against his primary calculation set, he'll shift to secondary positions that optimize different variables. How do we counter both simultaneously? Martinez asked through the CUM system. We don't have sufficient personnel to cover all possibilities. We don't need to, Margaret replied. We need to disrupt his ability to shift between models. The transition point is his vulnerability, the moment when he must recalculate all variables. For the next hour, Margaret worked with the field team to establish a strategy that would force Kingfisher into that vulnerable transition. Rather than trying to counter both calculation models, they would deliberately reveal countermeasures against his primary approach, forcing him to shift to his secondary model, where specialized countermeasures would already be waiting. As diplomatic convoys began arriving at the summit venue, tension in the command center escalated. Surveillance feeds showed security personnel establishing perimeters, sniffer dogs checking vehicles, plainclothes officers mingling with gathered crowds. Somewhere within this complex environment, Kingfisher was finalizing his calculations, preparing to execute with the mathematical precision that had made him so lethal for so long. Target identified, Wilson's voice suddenly reported. Southeast quadrant, moving on foot toward calculation point 3 alpha. Facial confirmation positive. Margaret immediately focused on that sector surveillance feed. There he was, the same man she had faced in Basra 15 years earlier. Older now, as was she, but moving with the same controlled precision. His eyes constantly gathering data for his mental calculations. He's running final variable confirmation, Margaret analyzed, checking actual conditions against his calculated model. She studied his movement pattern intently. He's using the primary calculation set. Position 3 alpha aligns with the mathematical optimum for current conditions. Permission to intercept. Hayes requested. Negative, Colonel Barrett responded after glancing at Margaret. Maintain surveillance. Let him commit to his approach before revealing counter-positioning. Margaret watched as Kingfisher continued his methodical preparation, invisible to anyone who didn't understand what to look for. To casual observers, he was just another man moving through a crowded area. To Margaret, every movement revealed his operational calculations. Every pause indicated a variable confirmation. He's proceeding to final position, she reported as he entered a building overlooking the arrival route. 3 alpha confirmed as primary target position. Exactly as calculated. Talon units in position, Hayes confirmed. Ready to execute on command. Now came the delicate part of their strategy. Timing was critical, revealing their counter-position. Too early would give Kingfisher time to fully implement his secondary model. Too late, and he might complete his operation before transitioning. Margaret monitored his progress through the building's security cameras. He moved with practiced efficiency, nothing in his demeanor triggering suspicion from security personnel or civilian occupants. On the 6th floor, he entered a utility room with line of sight to the arrival area below. He's in final position, Margaret reported. Beginning equipment assembly. The next 10 minutes unfolded with tense precision. Surveillance showed Kingfisher setting up his operation, not just a rifle, but a sophisticated integrated system that would calculate environmental variables in real time, supporting his mathematical approach with technological assistance. High-value target convoy approaching, Command Center Tactical reported. 3 minutes to arrival point. Margaret made the call. Execute counterposition reveal. Pattern Alpha. Hayes acknowledged, and one of their surveillance teams deliberately created visibility, revealing their counterposition to Kingfisher. Through the surveillance feed, Margaret saw his immediate reaction, the split-second pause, the rapid recalculation beginning in his eyes. He's recognized the counterposition, she reported. Transitioning to secondary calculation model now. Talon 2 and 3, shift to contingency positions, Colonel Barrett ordered. Prepare for intercept at secondary calculation points. Margaret watched as Kingfisher efficiently dismantled his setup. His movements showed no panic, only the smooth transition to an alternative approach, exactly as she had predicted. He exited the utility room, moving toward the emergency stairwell that would lead him to his secondary position. He's moving. To calculation point 5 Charlie, Margaret confirmed. Exactly as modeled, the trap was set. Based on Margaret's calculations, teams were already in position at the limited number of locations that would satisfy Kingfisher's secondary mathematical model. As he descended the stairwell, Martinez's team prepared to intercept. Target approaching your position, Talon 3, Margaret transmitted. 10 seconds. What happened next demonstrated why Kingfisher had remained elusive for so long. Somehow, perhaps through some subtle indicator Margaret hadn't accounted for, he sensed the trap. Instead of continuing down the stairwell, he exited at the 4th floor, immediately adapting his approach. He's deviating from the calculated model, Margaret reported, rapidly adjusting her equations. Implementing tertiary calculations we didn't anticipate. Where's he heading? Colonel Barrett demanded. Margaret's mind raced through the mathematical possibilities. If his primary and secondary models were compromised, what variables would he optimize in a tertiary approach? What mathematical solution would he calculate under these conditions? North Tower, she suddenly realized. He's shifting to a suboptimal firing position with superior escape parameters. Calculating now. 4th floor, northwest corner office. There's no team in that position, Hayes reported. Redirect Talon 1 and 4 to intercept, Colonel Barrett ordered. All other units maintain position in case this is a feint. Margaret focused intensely on her mathematical model. He's calculating a reduced probability shot with enhanced survivability variables. The equation still works but requires perfect timing to compensate for inferior positioning. On the surveillance feed, they caught glimpses of Kingfisher moving through the 4th floor toward the northwest section. He moved differently now, his previous methodical pace replaced by more efficient movement. He was adapting his entire approach in real time, recalculating all variables simultaneously. High-value target arrival in 60 seconds, Command reported. He'll need 20 seconds to set up from the new position, Margaret calculated. Intercept window is extremely narrow. Wilson's voice came through the CUM system. We're approaching the northwest section now. No visual on target yet. The next moments unfolded with agonizing tension. The high-value convoy approached the arrival point. Kingfisher reached the northwest office and began rapidly establishing his position. The tactical team moved to intercept, guided by Margaret's calculations. He's in position, Margaret reported, watching through security cameras as Kingfisher assembled his equipment with remarkable speed. Target acquisition imminent. Talon 1 status? Colonel Barrett demanded. 30 seconds from intercept. Position, Wilson reported. That's not fast enough, Margaret realized. Kingfisher was already in final preparation, his timing perfectly calculated despite the disruption to his primary and secondary models. His mathematical approach had allowed him to adapt with precision that few operators could match. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that bridged her two worlds completely. Drawing on both her operational experience and her mathematical expertise, she opened a direct communication channel to Kingfisher's position. Victor Kask, she said, using his real name. Your calculation model has a critical flaw. Through the surveillance feed, she saw him freeze momentarily, surprised by the sudden voice from the office's communication system. The wind variable shifted 7 degrees east in the last minute, Margaret continued. Your current calculation will result in a miss by approximately 3 centimeters. Enough to fail your operation parameters. It was a calculated risk, using mathematics to disrupt his concentration at the critical moment. Few people could have crafted such a precise distraction, one that would penetrate the intense focus of someone like Kingfisher. But Margaret understood exactly how his mind worked, how thoroughly he trusted his calculations. The momentary distraction was sufficient. As Kingfisher instinctively checked his environmental readings to verify her claim, Wilson's team breached the office. The intercept was precise and controlled. No shots fired, no collateral damage. Just the efficient neutralization of a threat by operators who understood exactly what they were facing. Target secured, Wilson reported moments later. Talon 1 has package. Proceeding to extraction point. In the command center, a brief cheer erupted before professionalism reasserted itself. Colonel Barrett placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of respect rarely offered in operational environments. That was unorthodox, he said. Mathematics is a universal language, Margaret replied simply. I calculated that. He would respond to a perceived flaw in his equations more reliably than to any tactical countermeasure, because that's how you would have responded in his position. Margaret didn't answer directly. The operation was successful. The threat has been neutralized with no casualties. Later, as the tactical team returned to the command center with their secured target, Margaret found herself face to face with Victor, Kask for the first time since their encounter in Basra. He was in restraints but held himself with the same mathematical precision she had observed through surveillance. His eyes met hers with immediate recognition. Echo, he said quietly. I thought you were dead. Similarly disappointed about you, Margaret replied. How did you know? He asked. About the calculation model transition? Because I would have built the same redundancy into my operational equations. A mathematically sound approach requires contingency variables. He studied her with professional curiosity rather than animosity. The wind variable, it hadn't actually shifted, had it? No. But your operational parameters demand precision. The possibility of a 3-centimeter error was statistically significant enough to warrant verification. Elegantly calculated, he acknowledged. Using mathematics itself as the countermeasure. I wouldn't have expected that approach from a conventional tactical team. I'm not conventional, Margaret said simply as security personnel prepared to transfer him to a secure facility. As he was led away, Cass glanced back. You're teaching now, he said, surprising her with his intelligence awareness. Mathematics at an American college. An interesting application of your skills. More fulfilling than our previous work, Margaret replied. A small smile touched his lips. Perhaps. Though the equations were always beautiful in their purity. The consequences weren't, Margaret said firmly. After Kask was transferred to custody, the tactical team gathered for debriefing. The atmosphere was charged with the unique energy that follows successful high-risk operations, a mixture of relief, pride, and the beginning of decompression. Dr. Chen, Wilson began, your mathematical approach to counter-operations was unlike anything I've encountered in 15 years of tactical work. You essentially predicted his every move before he made it. Not every move, Margaret corrected. He implemented a tertiary calculation model I hadn't fully anticipated. His adaptability has improved significantly since our last encounter. But you adjusted in real time, Martinez noted. That final communication strategy, using mathematics itself as a disruptor, that was brilliant. Margaret accepted the acknowledgement with a small nod. When facing someone who approaches operations mathematically, the most effective countermeasure is often mathematical rather than tactical. The question, Has said, is whether this approach would work against other high-value targets, or if it was uniquely effective against Kingfisher because of your shared background. Elements of mathematical prediction can enhance any counter-operation, Margaret replied. But the specific approach we use today was tailored to a particular adversary with a specific operational methodology. Colonel Barrett joined the conversation. Dr. Chen has provided us with a framework for approaching similar operations in the future. Her insights will be incorporated into our advanced training protocols. Wilson asked Margaret directly if she would be involved in developing those protocols. The question represented a crossroads, an opportunity to reconnect with the operational world she had left behind, to integrate her mathematical expertise with tactical applications in an ongoing capacity. For a moment, Margaret considered the possibility. The work would be intellectually stimulating, the impact potentially significant. But her mind returned to Westridge Community College, to her students waiting for her return, to the peaceful rhythm of academic life she had deliberately chosen. She thought of Emily, waiting for those promised office hours to discuss calculus problems with clear solutions and no life or death consequences. Margaret said firmly that her contribution ended with this operation. She was a mathematics professor now. That was the life she had chosen. Hayes responded with respect, noting that her skills were extraordinary and the operational community would benefit tremendously from her continued involvement, even in a limited consulting capacity. Margaret replied that there are many ways to serve, many ways to apply one's abilities. She had found where her skills could best contribute at this point in her life. Later that evening, as the operation transitioned to its final documentation phase, Margaret prepared for her return journey. Her temporary commissioning would end upon arrival in the United States, returning her fully to civilian status, to Dr. Margaret Chen, Mathematics Department Chair at Westridge Community College. Commander Reeves found her completing her after-action report. He mentioned that the colonel told him she had declined further involvement with operational training. Margaret reminded him that her involvement was always intended to be temporary, a specific response to a specific threat. Reeves studied her thoughtfully, asking if she ever missed it, the operational clarity, the mathematical purity of field work. Margaret considered the question seriously, explaining that sometimes she missed the immediacy, the direct connection between calculation and outcome. Academic work operated on longer timelines, with more diffuse results. When he pressed further, she said she didn't miss the consequences, echoing her earlier words. In her classroom, a miscalculation resulted in a teaching opportunity, not a casualty. The stakes were different in ways that mattered to her now. Commander Reeves nodded, understanding. He admitted that watching her work these past days had been remarkable. The integration of mathematical precision with operational awareness was a combination they rarely saw. Margaret suggested that perhaps that was why the Phantom Scope program was always classified. The approach didn't fit conventional operational paradigms. Reeves agreed it was true, but noted its effectiveness was undeniable. He extended his hand, saying it had been an honor working with her, whether she preferred Dr. Chen or Echo. Margaret replied that Margaret was fine, that Echo belonged to another time. The journey home gave Margaret time to process the events of the past days, the temporary resurgence of capabilities long unused, the integration of her mathematical expertise with operational necessities, the brief return to a world she had deliberately left behind. The experience had been intense, challenging, and oddly fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Yet as the plane approached American airspace, she felt the familiar transition beginning, the mental recalibration from operational focus to academic perspective. By the time she landed, Dr. Margaret Chen had fully re-emerged, Echo once again, carefully compartmentalized in the disciplined corners of her mind. President Harlow met her personally when she returned to campus, an unusual gesture that reflected both concern and curiosity. She welcomed Margaret back, noting she was missed. Margaret thanked her, saying it was good to return to normal life. The president studied her with perceptive interest, asking if it was as she expected, this consultation she was called away for. Margaret replied simply that it was necessary, and now it was complete. When asked if there would be other such consultations in the future, Margaret said no. This was a unique circumstance requiring specific expertise that wouldn't be repeated. President Harlow nodded, accepting the boundary Margaret had established. She mentioned that Margaret's students would be delighted to have her back, and that Emily had been practically camping outside her office, waiting for those promised office hours. The mention of her waiting student brought a genuine smile to Margaret's face. She said she would see Emily first thing tomorrow, as she had some calculus concepts to explain. The following morning, Margaret returned to her classroom with a sense of homecoming that surprised her with its intensity. As students filed in, greeting her with the casual familiarity of the academic environment, she felt the last vestiges of echo fading, replaced by the identity she had chosen and cultivated for 15 years. When Emily arrived for her office, hours struggling with application problems that had once seemed impossibly complex, Margaret guided her through the mathematical principles with patient clarity. She explained that the key was understanding that these equations represent relationships between variables. When you see how they connect, the solutions emerge naturally. Emily expressed relief, saying that the way Margaret explained it, math, felt less like memorizing formulas and more like discovering patterns. Margaret agreed, pleased by the insight, explaining that mathematics is ultimately about recognizing structure within complexity. As Emily gathered her materials to leave, she paused at the door, mentioning she had heard a strange rumor while Margaret was away. Someone said Margaret used to work for the military or something, that she was called away on some classified consultation. Margaret smiled slightly, noting that people often imagine dramatic explanations for ordinary absences. Emily laughed, agreeing that was what she thought, pointing out that Margaret was a math professor and questioning what the military would want with differential equations. Margaret agreed, though noted that mathematics has surprisingly diverse applications. After Emily left, Margaret stood at her office window, looking out at the peaceful campus with its orderly pathways and predictable rhythms. In Belgrade, the tactical team was probably still processing the operation, documenting the mathematical approach that had allowed them to counter one of the most elusive precision specialists in the field. Margaret didn't regret her decision to return fully to academic life. The Belgrade operation had confirmed what she had long believed, that her skills could serve different purposes in different contexts, that the mathematical foundation she had always relied upon could support diverse applications. In her classroom, those same principles now helped students understand the elegance of calculus rather than the precision of tactical operations. The stakes were different, the consequences less immediate, but the fundamental satisfaction of applying mathematical precision to solve problems remained the same. She had been Echo once, would always carry that capability within her. But she had chosen to be Dr. Margaret Chen, had built that identity through deliberate intention rather than operational necessity. The journey to Belgrade had demonstrated that both aspects of herself could coexist, could even complement each other when circumstances required. But as she prepared her lecture notes for tomorrow's class, Margaret knew with absolute certainty which identity she preferred, which life she had rightfully chosen. The quiet woman in pink earmuffs would return to Hawk's Nest this weekend, maintaining her skills with the same methodical precision she applied to all aspects of her life. And if the range instructors now treated her with newfound respect, if they studied her technique with professional curiosity rather than condescension, well, that was simply an unexpected variable in an equation that continued to evolve, just like mathematics itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.